The shadows of the antebellum South were not merely places of physical darkness, but were draped in a complex veil of silence, where every gesture, every song, and every stitch of fabric held the potential for liberation. Before we begin our journey into this intricate web of secrets, I invite you to subscribe to the Ink of History so we can continue uncovering these vital narratives together. Imagine standing in the middle of a tobacco field, under the blistering heat of a Virginia sun, the air thick with humidity and the weight of an unyielding system. To the overseer, the world was simple: labor, production, and order. But to the enslaved men and women working those rows, the world was a map woven into the very fabric of their daily existence. We are here today to pull back the curtain on the Underground Railroad, not just as a network of houses and hidden cellars, but as a sophisticated system of communication that utilized ancient African cultural wisdom to navigate the dangerous terrain of mid-19th century America. This was a silent language, a geometry of resistance that turned quilts, songs, and patterns into beacons of hope. The history of the Underground Railroad is often taught through the lens of individual heroism, focusing on famous figures like Harriet Tubman. Yet the true brilliance lay in the collective intelligence of those who transformed the mundane objects of their captivity into a compass pointing toward the North Star. We must understand that for the enslaved, the environment itself was an enemy. Literacy was forbidden. Written communication was a death sentence, and the brutal reality of the overseer's lash meant that information had to be transmitted in plain sight, hidden within the patterns of everyday life. This is where the synthesis of African cultural memory and American improvisation took flight. When we talk about the symbols of the Underground Railroad, we are discussing a visual language that required deep cultural literacy to decipher. Patterns stitched into quilts or carved into wooden tools were not merely decorative, they were instructions. A pattern known as the monkey wrench, for instance, was far more than a geometric shape on a bedspread. It was a call to gather the tools necessary for the journey, a signal that the time for preparation had arrived. Consider the complexity of the monkey wrench signal. It told those who saw it that they needed to prepare for the transition from the farm to the wild. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was a rhythmic instruction that operated within the cadence of slave life. The overseers, blinded by their own prejudices and convinced of the intellectual inferiority of their captives, looked at these quilts and saw nothing more than the domestic labor of women. They failed to recognize that the very textiles they used to keep warm at night were being turned against them, serving as the blueprints for emancipation. Every stitch was a coordinate. Every color carried a specific weight of meaning. By observing these patterns, we begin to see that the resistance was not just a sporadic event, but a continuous, disciplined process of communication that spanned hundreds of miles. As we delve deeper into this, we have to recognize the role of the Bowtie pattern, which warned the escaping slave to carry their possessions and dress in a way that mimicked the appearance of a free person. This was psychological warfare. By adopting the clothing and mannerisms of the free, those fleeing the plantation sought to vanish into the landscape of the North. It was a sophisticated understanding of social perception. They knew that the eyes of the white population were conditioned to look for a certain image of a slave, and by subverting that image, they created a mask that afforded them the freedom of movement. When you see a quilt with a bow tie pattern, you are looking at a masterclass in blending in, a strategy that allowed thousands to traverse the Mason-Dixon line without ever being detected. The North Star itself remained the ultimate, unchanging beacon, but the path toward it was notoriously difficult to verify in the dark. The North Star pattern, frequently appearing in quilt designs, served as the fundamental orientation tool. It was the anchor of the entire system. Without the knowledge of how to read the night sky, geography was an abstract concept. But when combined with the specific directions hidden in the quilt motifs, it became a reliable navigation system. The connection between the celestial navigation used by ancestors in Africa and the practical navigation required in the dark woods of the Carolinas is one of the most profound examples of cultural continuity in history. The enslaved did not leave their history behind when they crossed the Atlantic. They adapted it, refined it, and used it as a survival mechanism in a land that sought to strip them of their humanity. We must also speak of the wagon wheel, a symbol that signaled the time to be ready to travel, often with a hidden supply of food or water stored in the wheels or the base of a wagon. Life on the plantation was defined by the rhythm of production, and by using the tools of that production to signal the departure, the enslaved turned the master's own machinery into a vehicle for their escape. This is the core of the resistance, the ability to recontextualize their environment. If they were forced to work the wagons, they would use the wagons to facilitate their freedom. This constant, iterative process of turning the tools of oppression into the tools of liberation is what allowed the Underground Railroad to function for decades without a centralized headquarters. It was decentralized, organic, and entirely dependent on the shared, clandestine knowledge of the community. The role of melody cannot be overstated. Songs like Follow the Drinking Gourd were not just folk music, they were mnemonic devices. The drinking gourd referred to the Big Dipper, which pointed the way to the North Star. The lyrics, seemingly simple, were actually encoded maps detailing the rivers to follow, the landmarks to avoid, and the safe houses to seek out. When laborers sang in the fields, the overseers heard tunes of resignation or sorrow. In reality, they were hearing the transmission of tactical data. This is a critical distinction for our understanding of the period. The auditory landscape of the plantation was a binary world, one meaning for the oppressor and an entirely different, survival-focused meaning for the oppressed. To participate in these songs was to participate in a secret dialogue that transcended the physical boundaries of the plantation. We often discuss the Underground Railroad as though it were a singular, static path, but it was a fluid, shifting network that changed based on the danger levels in particular territories. When a bounty hunter was reported in a certain region, the symbols would change almost overnight. The patterns in the quilts would be rotated, or new, more urgent symbols would be introduced. This responsiveness is proof of the high level of coordination among the enslaved population. They were essentially running a covert communications operation under the noses of the most dangerous, well-armed individuals in the country. The intelligence they gathered about terrain, about the temperament of local patrols, about which Quakers were safe and which slave catchers were active, was shared with a speed that baffled contemporary observers. The importance of safe houses or stations was paramount. These were not just locations but nodes in the network that had to be identified through subtle signs. A specific arrangement of rocks in a stone wall, a certain color of fabric tied to a fence post. These served as the handshake of the underground. If a runaway slave arrived at a house, they did not simply knock on the door and ask for help. They had to prove they knew the language of the resistance. They had to present the codes. Without the proper recognition of these symbols, the risk of entering a house occupied by someone who might report them to the authorities was too great. The symbols acted as a filter, ensuring that only those who were part of the network could access the resources they needed to survive the next leg of their journey. We must examine the specific cultural roots of these designs. Many of the patterns found in these quilts share structural similarities with West African textile traditions, such as kente cloth or adinkra symbols, which are themselves deeply symbolic and communicative. When the enslaved women of the antebellum South wove these quilts, they were not just copying a style, they were engaging in a centuries-old tradition of recording history and instruction through visual art. It is a stunning realization that the patterns of the diaspora traveled across the Middle Passage, survived the trauma of enslavement, and re-emerged as the functional logic of a rebellion. This is not mere historical coincidence. It is a manifestation of memory as a weapon. The danger of this work cannot be overstated. To be a conductor on the Underground Railroad was to live in constant, immediate proximity to death. The laws of the time, specifically the Fugitive Slave Acts, meant that even in free states, the threat of capture was ever present. They had to prove they knew the language of the resistance. They had to present the codes. Without the proper recognition of these symbols, the risk of entering a house occupied by someone who might report them to the authorities was too great. The symbols acted as a filter, ensuring that only those who were part of the network could access the resources they needed to survive the next leg of their journey. We must examine the specific cultural roots of these designs. Many of the patterns found in these quilts share structural similarities with West African textile traditions, such as kente cloth or adinkra symbols, which are themselves deeply symbolic and communicative. When the enslaved women of the antebellum South wove these quilts, they were not just copying a style, they were engaging in a centuries-old tradition of recording history and instruction through visual art. It is a stunning realization that the patterns of the diaspora traveled across the Middle Passage, survived the trauma of enslavement, and re-emerged as the functional logic of a rebellion. This is not mere historical coincidence. It is a manifestation of memory as a weapon. The danger of this work cannot be overstated. To be a conductor on the Underground Railroad was to live in constant, immediate proximity to death. The laws of the time, specifically the Fugitive Slave Acts, meant that even in free states, the threat of capture was ever present. If you look at an old, faded photograph of a plantation cabin, you might see nothing but poverty. But if you have the key to the code, you see a hub of intelligence. You see the communication center of a clandestine army. You see the persistence of a culture that refused to be erased. As we reach the middle of our investigation, we have to address the evolution of these codes. As the abolitionist movement grew and the conflict between the North and South intensified, the methods of the Underground Railroad became more sophisticated. The integration of more formal, literate supporters provided a new layer of protection, but the core of the system remained the visual and auditory language developed by the enslaved themselves. The interaction between the enslaved and the free black communities, as well as the white allies, created a hybridization of information. We see, for instance, the influence of the Bible in many of the songs, where the story of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt became a powerful metaphor for the liberation of the enslaved. The Promised Land was the North, and Pharaoh was the slaveholder. This biblical framing provided a moral foundation that galvanized the movement and gave it a sense of inevitable justice. The logistical challenges were immense. Imagine trying to coordinate a journey of hundreds of miles in the dark, with no maps, no compasses, and the constant threat of dogs and armed patrols. The quilt codes were not meant to be taken with a traveler. That would be too dangerous. They were to be memorized or observed from afar. The log cabin pattern, for example, was a signal of a safe house where a person could find shelter and food. Its presence in a yard, usually hung on a clothesline, acted as a beacon. To the casual observer, it was laundry. To the seeker of freedom, it was a sanctuary. The genius of the system lay in this dual perception. It relied on the fact that the oppressors consistently underestimated the cognitive and strategic capabilities of the people they sought to control. We should also consider the shoe fly pattern, which indicated the presence of a guide or someone who could help the escapee navigate the next phase of the journey. These guides were crucial. They knew the shortcuts, the safe river crossings, and the schedules of the local authorities. The existence of these guides within the enslaved community, often moving between plantations under the guise of work, was a form of internal intelligence gathering that supported the entire network. These individuals were essentially the field agents of the movement, risking their lives every hour to ensure that the connections between the different nodes remained stable. The contribution of women in this network is particularly profound. Because they were often the primary workers in the home, the creation and management of the quilt codes were largely their responsibility. This was an act of domestic resistance that was as influential as any military campaign. They were the architects of the map. They were the ones who ensured the consistency of the symbols across generations and geographical regions. Their work reminds us that resistance is not solely a matter of armed conflict. It is also a matter of maintaining the infrastructure of survival. The resilience of the family and the community was the engine that powered the escape routes. As we move toward the final stages of our exploration, we must reflect on what this indicates about the nature of American history. We often view the history of the United States as a series of political decisions made in halls of power. But the story of the Underground Railroad shows us that the real history of the nation was being written in the fields, the kitchens, and the secret meeting places of the oppressed. The agency of the enslaved person is the central theme here. They were not passive recipients of freedom granted by others. They were the primary actors in their own liberation. They built the tools, they devised the systems, and they risked everything to navigate the path to freedom. The legacy of these symbols remains with us, though it is often obscured by time. We can see hints of it in the artistic traditions of the African American community, in the way quilts are still crafted as expressions of history and identity. There is a deep, profound connection between the functional, survival-oriented quilts of the mid-19th century and the artistic expression that followed in the 20th. It is a lineage of resilience. Every time a pattern is passed down, part of that story is preserved. It is a reminder that the history of America is inextricably linked to the struggle for freedom, and that the symbols we have discussed are not just artifacts, they are testaments to the triumph of the human will. Furthermore, we must address the psychological toll. The constant state of alertness, the need to decipher every environmental cue, and the weight of the secrets being kept. This shaped the consciousness of a generation. The collective trauma was real, but so was the collective strength. The Underground Railroad was not only a movement for escape, it was a movement for self-assertion. By declaring their own destiny, the enslaved were asserting their status as humans with rights, with intelligence, and with the capacity for self-determination. This is the moral force behind the movement. It was not just about getting from one side of a river to the other. It was about the fundamental refusal to be defined by the conditions of one's existence. Consider the complexity of the crossroads. This symbol was often used to indicate a point where the route split, or where a major decision had to be made about the next destination. It represents the uncertainty of the journey. Every escapee faced a series of crossroads, both literal and metaphorical. To choose the right path was to choose life, and to choose wrongly was to face capture or death. This is the essence of the human experience in the struggle for liberty. It is a series of choices, many of them agonizing, all of them weighted with consequence. The fact that so many found their way to the north is evidence of the extraordinary ingenuity and coordination of those who helped them, both known and unknown. We must also respect the diversity of the stories within the Underground Railroad. Not every journey ended in the north. Many sought refuge in the swamps, in the mountains, or by blending into the urban centers of the South. The symbols were versatile enough to accommodate these different strategies. They were not a rigid doctrine, but a flexible language. This flexibility is what allowed the network to survive for so long. It could adapt to the specific conditions of a region, the specific skills of a community, and the ever-changing tactics of the slave catchers. The role of the church in this environment was also multifaceted. While some used the Bible to justify slavery, others used the same text to provide a moral imperative for liberation. The spirituals sung in the plantations were often repurposed as codes, blending religious yearning for the afterlife with the very material yearning for freedom in this life. The song, "Steal Away to Jesus," was frequently used as a signal for a meeting or a departure. To the uninitiated, it was a hymn. To the enslaved, it was a tactical instruction. This deep integration of faith and resistance is a hallmark of the era. It provided a framework for hope in a world that was designed to destroy it. The physical dangers faced by the people involved in the Underground Railroad were constant. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made the situation even more dire, as it required even citizens of free states to assist in the capture of escaped slaves. This meant the entire nation became a hunting ground. The symbols had to become even more concealed, more cryptic. The use of natural markers, such as trees with specific blazes, or the use of stones placed in particular ways, became more common as the risk of informers increased. The network had to become more cellular, more intimate, and more cautious. We should acknowledge the significance of the flying geese pattern. Geese fly north in the spring, and this pattern served as a reminder that the season of migration had arrived. It was a call to action during the periods when escape was most viable. The patience required to wait for the right season, the right moment, and the right conditions is a testament to the discipline of the enslaved. They were not acting out of impulsive desperation. They were acting with calculated, deliberate strategy. This patience was a survival skill in itself. The legacy of these symbols and codes is also a challenge to our modern understanding of history. We are tasked with reading between the lines of the available records. Because so much of the Underground Railroad was kept secret, the documentation we have is fragmented. We are reliant on oral histories, on the preservation of material culture like quilts, and on the sparse, often biased records of the legal authorities. This requires us to be sensitive, careful researchers. We must listen to the voices of those who were silenced, and we must honor the complexity of their lives. When we look at the history of the United States, we see a nation that has struggled to come to terms with its past. The story of the Underground Railroad is central to that struggle. It reminds us that the quest for freedom is a constant, ongoing endeavor. It reminds us that the people who were once considered property were actually the architects of a sophisticated, nationwide movement for justice. This is a story of resistance that continues to resonate today. The symbols are gone, but the spirit of the struggle remains. The importance of the log cabin design cannot be emphasized enough, as it represented the physical dwelling that provided a temporary haven. It was a sign of safety in a world of danger. Every time a fugitive saw that pattern, they knew they had reached a place where they could rest, eat, and receive further instructions. This simple design, containing the essence of home and security, was the most important building block of the entire network. It transformed the environment into a place of sanctuary. We must also appreciate the double wedding ring pattern. While it is a common quilt design today, in the context of the Underground Railroad, it often signaled a union of effort, the need for two or more people to travel together for mutual protection. The idea of safety in numbers was a critical tactical consideration. By working in pairs or groups, the fugitives were less likely to be overwhelmed and more likely to be able to fend off threats. The communal nature of the resistance was its greatest protection. Reflecting on these symbols, we begin to see a narrative of incredible human courage. To walk into the night, guided only by the dim light of the stars and the hidden patterns of a quilt, is an act of supreme faith. It is a belief that there is a better world on the other side, and that the journey to reach it is worth the risk of life itself. This is the core of the American narrative, the one that is so often forgotten in the grand accounts of political events. It is the story of the individual, the community, and the silent, persistent, and successful struggle for freedom. As we reach the conclusion of today's episode, let us consider the weight of these memories. The patterns of the Underground Railroad are more than just historical artifacts. They are the fingerprints of a revolution that occurred in the shadows. They are the evidence that, even in the depths of oppression, the human mind refuses to be confined. The struggle for freedom is a theme that runs through the history of all people. But the specific, unique, and brilliant way that the African American community used their cultural heritage to chart the path to liberation is a story that demands to be remembered, studied, and honored. The legacy of the Underground Railroad is not just in the history books, it is in our understanding of what it means to be free. It reminds us that freedom is not a static state, but an aspiration that requires constant vigilance, courage, in action. It reminds us that our ancestors were not just victims, but the architects of their own destiny, maneuvering through the most hostile of landscapes with a wisdom that had been passed down through generations. The codes, the songs, and the quilts were the tools that allowed them to survive the darkness and find their way to the light. In our contemporary world, we can find inspiration in this history. We are all facing our own challenges, our own systems of limitation, and our own need for navigation. The lesson of the Underground Railroad is that we possess the tools to navigate our own paths, provided we are willing to learn from the wisdom of those who came before us. We must be willing to look at the world differently, to see the signs that are hidden in plain sight, and to act with the courage of our convictions. This is the ultimate lesson of the story we have told today. Before we conclude, take a moment to reflect on the stories we have uncovered. The history of the Underground Railroad is a vast, complex, and vital part of the American experience. It is a story that needs to be shared, and by engaging with these narratives, you are helping to keep them alive. If you found this investigation into the hidden codes and symbols of the Underground Railroad valuable, I encourage you to share this story with others. Let us ensure that the ingenuity, the resistance, and the triumph of our ancestors are not forgotten. We must also recognize that the work of historical recovery is an ongoing process. There are many more stories to be told, many more symbols to be deciphered, and many more voices to be heard. The ink of history is dedicated to this mission of uncovering the complex, the hidden, and the essential narratives of the past. Your participation in this process, your interest, your questions, and your support is what makes this possible. We are not just uncovering history, we are forging a connection to it. The strength of the Underground Railroad lay in its ability to adapt, to communicate, and to endure. These are the same qualities that are needed in our lives today. We must learn to communicate across the divides, to adapt to the changing landscape of our society, and to endure in our commitment to justice and equality. The symbols of the past provide us with a map, not for a physical journey, but for the moral and intellectual journey we are all on. In ending this narrative, let us honor those who walk the path. Let us honor the nameless, the forgotten, and the brave who risked everything for the sake of freedom. Their legacy is the very fabric of our national identity. It is a legacy of resilience, of brilliance, and of an unyielding faith in the possibility of a better future. When we look at the history of the Underground Railroad, we are not looking at a closed chapter, but at an open invitation to continue the work of liberty. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the hidden codes of the Underground Railroad. The history we have discussed is profound, and its implications are far-reaching. As we continue our exploration of the African-American experience in the 19th century and beyond, we will keep digging, keep questioning, and keep bringing these vital stories to light. Your support is the foundation of this work. Please subscribe to The Ink of History, leave a comment with your thoughts on these symbols, and share this video with those who value the deep, often dark, and always inspiring history of human struggle. We look forward to seeing you in our next episode as we continue to ink the history of our shared past, piece by piece, story by story, until the whole picture of our humanity is revealed. Freedom, justice, and the truth of history, these are the goals that drive us. Together, we can ensure that these stories will never be lost to the silence of time. The map is in your hands now. How will you navigate the path forward? Stay curious, stay informed, and keep the flame of the past burning bright. This has been The Ink of History, where we believe that every story matters, every voice counts, and the truth, no matter how hidden, deserves to be told. See you next time. The transition from the symbolic language of the Underground Railroad to the broader reality of the abolitionist movement requires us to look beyond the quilts and the secret signals. It demands an examination of the logistics of survival, the complex networks of kinship, and the terrifying reality of the fugitive slave laws that turned the entire American landscape into a theater of surveillance. While the quilts functioned as the poetry of liberation, the prose was written in the grit of those who braved the swampy depths of the Great Dismal Swamp, or the frigid, unforgiving winters of the northern frontier. We must consider the psychological toll of this existence, a state of perpetual flight where the rustle of leaves or the bark of a distant hound could signify the end of autonomy. When we speak of the Underground Railroad, we often paint it as a heroic tapestry of benevolent strangers. Yet beneath this romanticized veneer lies a far more chaotic, desperate, and dangerous endeavor. It was not a formal organization with a headquarters or a ledger of dues. It was a fragmented, improvised series of micro-decisions made by people who had everything to lose. The conductor was not always a seasoned activist. Often it was an enslaved mother who decided that the risk of the woods was safer than the certainty of the auction block. These were people whose agency was systematically stripped away by law and custom, yet they asserted it with every step they took toward the North Star. Consider the role of the environment itself as a silent collaborator in this odyssey. The geography of the American South was not merely a backdrop. It was a labyrinthine tool of either capture or concealment. The dense thickets, the winding waterways, and the treacherous wetlands were obstacles for the plantation owners' trackers, but they were highways for the determined. Those who escaped often studied the migration patterns of birds, the growth of moss on trees, and the shifting constellations, effectively becoming amateur naturalists out of sheer necessity. This deep, intimate knowledge of the land challenges our perception of the enslaved as passive entities. They were map makers of the soul and the soil, navigating a terrain that was designed to keep them confined. The danger, however, was not exclusive to the fugitives. The white abolitionists who risked their standing, their property, and their lives were participating in a radical subversion of the social contract. To aid a fugitive was to commit treason against a system that viewed human beings as property. In cities like Philadelphia, Boston, and Cincinnati, these networks created a shadow society. They maintained safe houses that were functionally invisible to the casual observer, equipped with hidden compartments, trapdoors, and cellar passages that transformed mundane domestic spaces into sanctuaries of defiance. The architectural footprint of the Underground Railroad remains in the floorboards and hollow walls of homes that still stand today, ghosts of a time when a knock at the door could mean the difference between a life of bondage and a life of self-determination. We must also confront the reality of the legal apparatus that sought to destroy this movement. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 did not just sharpen the teeth of the slave catchers. It turned every citizen into a potential agent of the state. It essentially made the entire North an occupied territory for the enslaved, as there was no longer a safe haven within the borders of the United States. This era marked a profound crisis of conscience for the nation. It forced individuals to choose between the letter of the law and the dictates of their morality. Many chose to break the law, not because they were criminals, but because the law itself had become the primary instrument of moral decay. This period of intense conflict serves as a reminder that institutionalized injustice can only be dismantled through the persistent, often illegal, actions of those who refuse to remain silent. The narrative of the Underground Railroad is also intimately tied to the emergence of the independent black press. Figures like Frederick Douglass, whose own escape was a masterclass in ingenuity and courage, understood that the narrative of freedom had to be controlled by those who had lived the experience of enslavement. Through publications like The North Star, they publicized the atrocities of slavery while simultaneously galvanizing the abolitionist movement. They provided a counter-narrative to the dehumanizing rhetoric used by enslavers, asserting their intellectual capacity, their political acumen, and their inherent right to participate in the democratic process. This was a battle for the American mind, and the tools they used were ink, paper, and the unwavering truth of their own lived experiences. As we delve deeper into this, we encounter the stories of those who, having achieved their own freedom, returned to the South to lead others out. The heroism of individuals like Harriet Tubman is legendary, but we must remember that she was part of a larger, collective effort. There were dozens, perhaps hundreds, of lesser-known conductors who made multiple trips into the heart of danger. These individuals possessed a level of tactical brilliance that would rival any military commander. They navigated, they bribed, they deceived, and they defended, all while operating under the constant threat of being sold back into the very nightmare they had escaped. Their bravery was not a sudden burst of adrenaline, but a sustained commitment that spanned years of their lives. Looking at the broader implications, we see how these experiences shaped the post-Civil War era. The resilience forged in the fires of the Underground Railroad did not dissipate with the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. It evolved into the foundational spirit of the Reconstruction era, the fight for civil rights, and the ongoing struggle for racial equity. The methods of organizing, the secret meetings, the coded language, the reliance on community support became the blueprint for future social movements. We are essentially observing the evolution of a people who, having been denied a voice, created their own language of resistance. There is a profound lesson in the silence that many of these individuals maintained even after the war. For many, the horrors of their escape were too painful to articulate. They had lived through a trauma so profound that it defied description. Yet their very existence as free people was a testament to their victory. And for those who did choose to speak, through narratives, songs, and oral histories, they left behind a legacy that demands our attention. We are not just preserving history for the sake of the past. We are ensuring that the lessons learned from the struggle for freedom remain relevant in our contemporary society. The symbols we discussed in our previous segments, the quilts, the songs, the North Star, are more than just historical artifacts. They are universal symbols of hope. They represent the human capacity to find light in the darkest of circumstances. When we analyze these symbols, we are actually analyzing the human spirit's refusal to be crushed. The drinking gourd, for example, was more than just a song about the Big Dipper. It was a survival manual transmitted through melody. It reminds us that knowledge is the ultimate form of power. When you control the information, you control the survival of your community. As we move forward in our investigations at the ink of history, we are committed to highlighting these often overlooked dimensions of the African American experience. We aim to peel back the layers of myth to reveal the human reality, to bridge the gap between the academic study of history and the emotional resonance of these individual stories. Each of these ancestors was a person with dreams, fears, and a complex identity that was systematically denied by the structures of their time. By restoring their humanity, we restore a piece of our own. The journey does not end with the resolution of one conflict. History is a continuous dialogue between the past and the present. Every time we encounter a story of the Underground Railroad, we are forced to reevaluate our own responsibilities as citizens. If they could risk everything for a freedom they might never fully enjoy, what is our responsibility to the ideals of justice that we claim to uphold today? The question is not rhetorical. It is a direct challenge to the comforts of our modern lives. The map they left behind is one of moral courage. We continue this work because history is the anchor of our identity. Without it, we are directionless, prone to the same cycles of ignorance and bias that have plagued societies throughout time. By keeping the flame of this history burning, we are protecting the future from the darkness of forgetting. We invite you to stay engaged, to question the narratives you are fed, and to dig deeper into the foundations of the world around you. The stories of the Underground Railroad are not just stories of the 19th century, they are stories of the human condition. They teach us about the power of solidarity, the necessity of risk, and the enduring nature of hope. As we continue to document these narratives, we find that the more we learn, the more we realize how much of our history remains obscured by the shadows of neglect. It is our duty to shine the light, to bring these voices into the present, and to recognize that the work of liberty is never truly finished. We thank you for the dedication you have shown in following this series. Your engagement makes it possible for us to continue this vital, necessary research. The chapters yet to be written are as significant as those we have already covered. Together, we will continue to explore the complexities of our shared heritage, ensuring that no voice is silenced and no story is left untold. The Ink of History is a collective project, and you are an integral part of its unfolding narrative. Stay with us as we continue to traverse the landscape of the past, uncovering the secrets of the road, the strength of the travelers, and the enduring truth of the human desire for freedom. Every episode brings us closer to a more complete understanding of who we were, who we are, and who we have the potential to become. The path is long, but the destination, a world built on true justice and equality, is well worth the journey. Keep your eyes on the horizon, keep your mind open to the truths of the past, and continue to carry the torch of memory. We will see you in the next installment, where the story continues and the ink never dries.